Gaia GPS is an amazing tool for backcountry navigation. It's not a substitute for map and compass, but it's a wonderful addition to having your toolkit for navigation. But like any tool, knowing how to use it is very important. When using Gaia GPS, you're still reading a map. But the thing about Gaia GPS and any backcountry navigation software for your mobile device is what map layer you're going to use. Through mainly trial and error, I found that certain types of layers work better than others than what you're doing. Around here, it will show some old mining roads where another layer won't. Some layers are easier to read. Some will show some archaeological sites, etc., etc., etc. So I find my quiver of map layers, I tend to have 4 or 5 different layers where I'm going, and some show different attributes than others. So what I thought I'd do is I go over the different layers and why I'm using it. I find some layers are better than others, depending upon what I'm doing. And I find if I have these particular layers downloaded to my phone ahead of time, I have the full course of maps I need to navigate. Yes, I could have 5 or 6 different layers, or maps rather, in print form shoved in my pocket, but that's not as practical. So again, I use Gaia GPS as an addition to my toolkit to work well with traditional map and compass. I'll have the 5 or 6 different layers I need for a given area, and I will have a print overview map on me depending upon what I'm doing. So with no further ado, let me show you the different layers I use with Gaia GPS and why I like using them. And I'll go over a little bit over the particular overview print map I always like to carry on me too. So what I have up on my screen right now is the actual screenshot of the layers I tend to use with Gaia GPS. Across the border or mountain areas in general, such as in Colorado, I will use the shaded relief map. I really find the satellite with labels view to be the most updated. Gaia's topo layer is a lot better than it used to be. I found it useful, especially for older trails or mining roads that are on some other layers. USGS topo is the classic layer I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I really like the USFS 2016 layer just because it's clean and it's pretty easy to read and gives me useful information. And finally, the NatGeo Trails Illustrated layer will give a lot of information about trails, as you would expect from a name like that, as well as more recent information. But, you know, I find this layer is not as useful. It's just really outdated in many ways, missing a lot of information, such as even current roads, never mind old roads. Trail placement is not always correct. I don't think, frankly, they're ground truthing these maps as much as they used to, but I still find it a pretty good layer to have on my phone because it is easy to read and gives some quick information at a glance for an overview. So this is the layer screenshot for the phone, but just for ease of recording purposes, I'm just going to show you the desktop version of Gaia, which is fairly much the same as far as information, and it'll just be easier to show you the different layers. So we're going to start with a recent trip Jen and I did in Colorado. Really illustrates why I like different layers for different things. This is the classic NatGeo layer, Trails Illustrated. Good overview. For the most part, it is lacking a lot of information, not only with older trails and roads, but even current ones that aren't on the map quite correctly. One of these roads over here, frankly, does not exist as it is, and only from a past trip that I know it really existed somewhere else. I just traced it that way just for ease and convenience, showing the route we more or less took at one point. And it just emphasized to me how much these TI maps just aren't as useful anymore. I've pretty much given up on these maps in the nearby La Salle Mountains and use a different print map. What I do find is that no layer is particularly good. It just takes a combination, which is why I'm doing this particular video. So anyway, that's just the Trails Illustrated layer. Nothing too fancy. It just shows you what's there. Take it with a large grain of salt. The next layer I like to use, especially in Colorado, is the shaded relief map. It's really good if you're climbing peaks, especially off trail or questionable trails that may or may not be in existence. Just a really quick overview of the terrain you might see. And yes, you can mix and match layers with Gaia GPS, as I'm sure most people know. It comes in useful for different purposes, but just for illustration purposes, I just want to show the layers at a quick glance. Yes, you can read topo lines and you can read elevation gain and loss of the roots, but I find this is just a really quick way to ballpark my gain, especially mountain areas, getting to basins, etc. Now, as I mentioned before, I love this USFS 2016 layer. I find it's really useful. It shows some of the older trails are still in existence. It's the Forest Service layer, so it's not always most updated with different things, especially compared to the NatGeo layer. Just to illustrate, this gives you all the topo lines and it's easy to read, but doesn't necessarily show such useful things as, I don't know, the bathroom over here, which did exist. So think of the NatGeo layer as kind of a tourist/casual hiker layer, good enough for any maintained trails like the Colorado Trail, Continental Divide Trail over here. I wouldn't use it for any off the beaten path exploring. Okay, going back a little bit. So that was just a quick overview of the USFS layer, which I tend to enjoy quite a bit. It's kind of my go-to layer for many things when it's in Forest Service land, of course. Now, if I'm in BLM land or say state land, etc., you cannot go wrong with the US topographic layer. It is the most detailed layer as far as the contour lines. It's going to show some older things, not always, as you can see here. A lot of times, especially off the beaten path areas such as in Canyon Country, BLM land, it's the only map available. Very detailed. Of course, as most of you know, has been really updated since the 1990s, quite literally. So it's very detailed, but not necessarily the most up-to-date. But again, it's a good layer to have my map quiver. The next layer I tend to use a fair amount is the Gaia topo layer. They've updated, meaning Gaia updated their map, so it's a lot more useful than in times past. It'll show some of the older trails. It'll give some more detailed information. Sometimes the placement's more updated than the other layer. So I don't use it all the time, but it's certainly good to give it a quick glance. Having said all that, the layer I find I'm using more and more lately, just because maps aren't updated as much as I would like, is a satellite layer with labels. It showed the correct placement of the road versus the other maps show the road incorrectly. And this is actually a very well-maintained dirt road, popular with ATVers, mountain bikers, and jeepers. A standard stock four-wheel drive vehicle can take it, so it's relatively popular. And the placement is correct. It doesn't show the labels here as much until I zoom in a bit. We'll see if it's going to make a liar out of me. There we go. So it actually did show the labels and the roads, and I often find that's a good layer to save to my phone. On the phone, it actually shows the labels a bit easier than me zooming in, zooming out. It shows the boundary markers, as you can see here. It gives some detailed kind of shade relief type info. So I just find it a good go-to layer to go to overall. I should also mention, as I'm going through the different layers here, the other advantage of this USGS layer that I found very useful, not so much here, is that it'll show archaeological sites. I'm not going to show it on the map because we want to keep archaeological sites hidden in plain sight. But when Joan and I go looking for Puebloan dwellings or some rock images, oftentimes USGS Topo will have these things listed that newer maps won't. Security through obscurity, as I would say, wearing my IT hat. And I find if I'm looking for archaeological sites, USGS works pretty well. So in a nutshell, that is all the layers I tend to like. The NatGeo layer, if I'm looking just kind of a tourist, popular type area, USGS, by far for the most detailed, if not the most updated. Gaia, once in a great while, because it'll show the older mining roads and trails that, ghost trails that may be still in existence and used, but not readily apparent on other maps. I love the Forest Service layer when available, just because I think it's the easiest to read and shows a good amount of detail and some older information, as you can see here. And I find over the years I've been going to the satellite view with labels. It's the most updated. Can't use it for navigation per se, but I find if I need to question if a road is in existence or if I want to zoom in a lot and see if that old mining trail is still in use. As you can see here, it's very faint, but I can see something's there. I find that's a good go-to as well. And finally, as I mentioned, more so for mountainous areas like Colorado or the nearby LaSalle, I find the shaded relief map can be a really quick and dirty go-to to find what kind of terrain am I going up to. It's taking a little while to render, but here you go. So that overall is what I find very useful for Gaia GPS. And the layers I like to keep on my phone, not always a shaded relief, but certainly the other 4 or 5 depending. NatGeo is not available in every area, neither is USFS, but US Topo and Gaia Topo and satellite with labels is certainly available all the time, at least I've seen. While Gaia GPS is a very powerful tool, and I'm still using it to read a lot of maps, I also recognize that print maps still have their place, and I would argue are still very much needed. A 5-inch or so phone screen is not going to give the large overview of a print map, and a print map gives a good backup to if your primary tool of, let's say, Gaia GPS fails for whatever reason. I tend to still use print maps a lot more for large overview at a glance, but I find more and more I am looking at Gaia GPS for map reading. But sometimes it's just quicker to look at a print map. And frankly, it's good to have that skill, and any backcountry person should know how to read a print map. Now that I've given my little lecture on a soapbox, let me tell you what print maps I enjoy using. As I mentioned, the NatGeo Trails Illustrated kind of the benchmark when available for print overview maps. But I find they're just not as useful anymore. The ground truthing is not as good as it used to be, and other than popular areas, I find it's inaccurate. Many times it's the only one that's available. What I like, or what I think is these smaller regional companies. Latitude 40 covers a lot of the Utah and Colorado area. The LaSalle Mountains are the only layer I find to be accurate, electronic or otherwise. They're a bit too large in scale for really in-depth type navigation, but I combine this Latitude 40 map with the USGS layer, and I can do a lot of navigation off trail and in the canyons, etc. And I find they're just a great map for this area. Whenever a new edition comes out, we tend to buy the latest one. I mean, you can see behind the rocks here, not too far from me, has a lot of different information. So on and so forth. I find the LaSalle Mountains, it's a really good one to have. You can see a list of trails, so it's kind of a bit much better Trails Illustrated map for this area. Again, the detail is not as good as, say, USGS, but again, I'm using this more as an overview, and it works pretty well. It's the only map of any layer, electronic or otherwise, I will trust for the LaSalle Mountains. So that's become more and more of the go-to for Joan and I when we need a print overview map that will give us, particularly for route planning or looking at some obscure areas where there's still some old roads and mining trails that are still in use to a certain extent. Now, as I said, I call them smaller regional. One thing I used a lot in Colorado when I lived there are the sky terrain maps, and I'll have all the links for them later on. It's a gentleman who ground truths everything. They're very accurate, show some of the older trails or roads, and like any other mountainous area, the mining trails and so forth. Very, very good maps if they're available. Again, just a small regional company. Unfortunately, these companies are vanishing. I heard Earthwalk Press, for example, which made a lot of the popular Wind River Range maps, are no longer producing maps, for example. Now, I don't use these maps too often, or actually hardly at all, but for those in California, you're probably familiar with the Tom Harrison maps, and I'm bringing this up just to show another example of a regional company. I've only used it a little bit 10 years ago when I did the Tahoe Rim Trail, but this is an excellent example of a smaller regional map company that produces some very good, very excellent maps. This one I happened to pull up for Desolation Wilderness. This one actually has a really good scale, and it was updated in 2018. You can probably trust these maps more so than other ones. The unfortunate thing about the smaller regional companies is that they're not in existence as much anymore, and they're finding it hard as people will shift to electronic, in which case you have to print out your own maps, or you can even order some from the U.S. Forest Service. They do have some updated type of maps, just not as easy in electronic form. So that's what I like to use, preferably for my particular print maps. If I absolutely have to, the NatGeo covers many areas, but I find they're lacking. I like these smaller companies I mentioned, such as the Latitude 40 or the Sky Terrain maps, or as another example, if you're in the California area, the Tom Harrison maps. So print maps aren't going away. I think they're far more useful for an overview than an electronic resource. A big map versus a 5-inch screen certainly is a lot more useful to me. And again, they are an excellent backup. As I said, I'm still reading the map even when using Gaia. It's just a lot easier with Gaia sometimes because you can have many different types of maps that shows different information versus multiple print maps, as I would do even as recently as 5 to 10 years ago. Gaia GPS is a Gaia GPS is a very powerful tool, but like any tool, you have to know how to use it correctly. And knowing how to use it is knowing which layers will work for a particular area or situation, what information you need. With those layers I showed you, that's what works really well for me. They're not ideal, it's not going to show everything, but by mixing and matching, I find I can get the information I need for navigating. And I do mean navigating because a lot of times I'm not even using the where am I factor of the GPS. I'm looking at the maps to help plan a route in the field or get additional information. Or as in the case of last week of Joan and I finding a better weather route when it was very windy above tree line. And we found a very lovely old rail grate that went along the water and had fantastic foliage, which if we didn't know how to read a map and didn't have the right layer, we may not have found. Having said that, there is still a need, and you need to know how to read a print map. Print maps are much larger, will give you a much bigger overview, and I find sometimes it's actually easier to read them in the field versus a 5-inch phone screen. The maps I like for overview tend to be these regional map companies. I mentioned Latitude 40, a lot of times for Colorado and Utah. Sky Terrain for the Front Range, back when I lived in the Boulder, Denver area, are also very excellent maps. Not as familiar with the Tom Harrison maps, only use them a little bit, but they're kind of a benchmark standard for the California area. Research the area, find out what other maps are available in the area. For a print map, I find gear shops are a great way to find these regional map companies. If you cannot find these smaller regional maps, which tend to be ground truth, tend to be accurate, tend to be regularly updated, then NatGeo is an okay substitute and is widely available. If you absolutely cannot find any good overview print map for the area, you can always make your own. With CalTop is what I like to use for printing maps. Gaia GPS is okay, quite frankly, when it comes to printing maps. But the disadvantage of that, no matter what you use of print maps, you have a lot of different pieces of paper versus one large overview, but it's what you have to do many times. So like anything else, learn how to use your tool and find out what works for you while using the tool, and you'll have a really good time in the backcountry. Until then, happy trails.